And I want to present 5 reasons why I think the question is a good question, / what I think asking this question might require of future theological research. And of course, part of the richness of our discussions is the opportunity to see something new, hear a different perspective on this, and the kind of interesting, intense ways that we might have different answers and disagree. And I very much am looking forward to that. But let me jump straight into it so we can get to the much more interesting and much more important insights and reflections you have brought to share. Number 1, with comprehensive globalization, theologies that from a local perspective were once confessed as universal came to be recognized as placed alongside one another, specific to particular contexts. Also, in that process, there came and still comes a realization that theologies, even these particular theologies, are themselves externally plural, but internally very diverse. Now, this, to use sort of stereotypical insider-outsider language, this experience could be somewhat destabilizing for the insider, and it can be difficult then for theologians, especially at public universities, to answer a colleague's question, what do you do in a Protestant theological faculty? Why do we need a Protestant theological faculty and a Catholic faculty and not a Pentecostal and an Orthodox and we have Altkatholisch. But this pluralization and internal diversification, in any case, cannot be ignored. Rather, these must be taken up into the work of researching religious communities' understandings of themselves. So, this is to say that theology is always contextual. That includes the theology that we do in our respective contexts. There are more seats in the front here. And in order to remain self-aware of this contextuality in theological work on theology, I suggest, must be done comparatively. Contextually implies comparatively. And it's also why we're starting this symposium in our first session by asking the question, what difference does a difference make? What difference does it make that we do theology and experience theological reflection in highly specific contexts? Point 2. The kind of contextualization that appears with globalization is not merely an interrelation of one or more cultures, but a trans-relation featuring extensive, functional, communicative complexity. In choosing to work with the term transcultural in our title, I am not trying to use trendy or sexy language. We're not doing intercultural, we're doing transcultural theology. Rather, the concern is that in contemporary societies, the prepositionality of the inter is misleading, or risks being misleading. And the concept of culture, from my own scientific orientation, is almost too beset with problems to be useful. The prepositionality of the inter, taken with the cultural, intercultural, is particularly risky to the extent that it implies a joint between two internally undifferentiated blocks. In attempting to observe the particularity of context, however, one quickly finds it necessary to ask which context. And answers to this question, the contexts that one could consider, they will look separate or overlapping, single or multiple, depending on the perspective from which one views the field. Wealthy, are we looking at the wealthy or the poor? Educated, not educated? Are we locating ourselves in Western European, Eastern European, Middle Eastern, African, North African, or Sub-Saharan African, Southeast Asian, North American, Latinx communities with an immigration or non-immigration background? If immigration, first, second, or third immigration backgrounds. In terms of religion, are we looking at Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindu, Buddhist, secular, any number of combinations of those? And if Christian, then Orthodox, Catholic, Pentecostal, Protestant in its few hundred variations. The different ways of combining these variables, middle class, Western European Christian, for example, but with a second generation immigration background, the different possibilities for deciding on a context. We're into the thousands of possible contexts, just to sort of put it quantitatively for the purpose of illustration. Possible demographic and functional contexts. So theology, because it is contextual, and because it must be conducted comparatively, I want to suggest is helpfully approached not specifically interculturally, but rather in terms of contexts of complexity. And that's why I'm working with the term transcultural contexts, transcultural modernities. Third, attention to transcultural complexity will inevitably then push theological research through extensive methodological diversification. On the one hand, theological work will continue to become more empirically driven. And this trend is already reflected in the study of exegesis, Hebrew Bible, early Christianity, within the history of Christianity, studying the history of Christianity more broadly, and also in practical theology. But it remains an important horizon for theological research, whether systematic theology can make it around the empirical turn, and if so, how it is to do so. I think that it can, and I should note in a footnote, there are some important current thinkers doing this, but it's very, very much in the beginning stages. We're at the stage of needing to develop methodologies that early. I think it can do this. I think that there is important work for it to do, but I think that it will mean doing systematic theologies, plural, and in the field, embedded in particular concrete empirical contexts. Systematic theological fieldwork, doing things like collecting, documenting, and interpreting the religious frameworks in and with communities of self and other, in all of the complexities of the transcultural. The focus of academic systematic theology in Europe has already shifted from a revelation-based paradigm that proclaims revealed truth from the position of our faculty at the university or something like that to everyone. There's already been a shift from this to a communication-oriented paradigm that seeks to understand religious communities and the ways that their beliefs and values and their overall forms of life mutually form and inform one another. So far in Protestant systematic theology, this is taking place on the level of philosophy of religion and things like interreligious philosophy of religion. However, the next logical phase of development would be embedded systematic theological fieldwork, viewing systematic theologies as intentional, reflected religious communications that can be viewed in a way, as you saw in the description, as social artifacts, and then using qualitative research methods to investigate the formation and circulation of these communications as they operate in their communities. So, systematic theology, transcultural theology, and the empirical. Number 4, all of which leads me to the question at hand. What does theology do, actually? That is the question. It is not asked rhetorically, and despite the fun, it's not asked cynically, as though theology doesn't actually do anything. But it is asked without me having an answer. I don't have an answer, and I think good answers today to that question, will have to be, again, documented, in the field, collected, analyzed in meaningful cooperation with local specific contexts. If systematic theology is to be done contextually, comparatively, and with attention to transcultural complexity, my proposal is that this question itself become a programmatic question for theological research in the years ahead. How do we do systematic theology, and how do we do theology in our other subdisciplines? We can ask the question, what is theology doing in this, that, or the other context? So what is theology doing? Whom does theological work serve? What theological work does it do for them? And how does theological work function to relate those whom it serves to explicit and implicit goals or purposes, concerns, and hopes? These are very large questions, admittedly, but they can be made specific, I wager, through focus on instances of the production of theology by concrete communities as they react to challenges of social complexity brought on by the forces of globalization and functional differentiation of society. By comparing contexts, addressing similar constellations of change and challenge, we might be able to outline some of the dynamics of theological communication in the evolving formation of Christian identities vis-a-vis other Christian communities, so the ecumenical point, vis-a-vis other non-Christian communities, and vis-a-vis society at large. Studying the functions of theology, what theology does in transcultural settings, is itself an important part of what theology does. Number 5. Perceiving, and this is my concluding point, perceiving the existence, let alone the complexity, of some of the most significant changes that are taking place in Christianity globally, presents a profound challenge to us in European Protestant theology specifically. And this is why I'm very grateful that we have a very international collection of speakers, at least 8 countries represented. We have Protestant and Catholic, and we have both theology and religious studies, but also philosophy, also cultural anthropology, and development studies. So this is an opportunity to ask ourselves what theology does, as well as to listen to answers from others who might have an idea or an impression or a feeling about what theology is doing from a different academic position. But perceiving the existence and the complexity of significant changes in Christianity globally, outside of European theology and European Protestant theology specifically, is difficult. Among the most significant developments, one could list the global growth and, again, internal differentiation of Pentecostalisms. So not only do we need to learn what Pentecostalism is, but we need to learn that there are more than one of them, and that there are different facets and varieties and complexities involved, including one that one of our speakers has a lot of knowledge of, oneness Pentecostalism, and how we might relate to that. There is a proliferation of liberation, political, and identity-oriented theologies. There have been ground-level hybrid theologies forming and sustaining life among communities with immigration backgrounds. These are all difficult for us to perceive a lot of the time in our course of academic study. There are good and understandable and not so good reasons for all of this, but the fact of the matter is that few of the actors involved in these developments are capable of coming to sort of study with us, do research with us, and going the other direction. It is nearly impossible, or it requires extensive years of training and preparation to go from a European context to a highly specific non-European contexts with different languages, different religions, different cultural customs. And so there's this sort of lag time that's almost, or feels often, insurmountable. So how do we facilitate perceiving the existence and the complexity of non-European Protestant theologies or Christian theologies more broadly? That's what happens when you look away from your script and start to speak freely. But in conclusion, the transcultural framing, in its approach to context as complexity, challenges academic theology to contextualize itself and recognize its particularity, and challenges theology to work more comparatively and therefore more empirically and closer to life. It suggests that the question, what does theology do actually, might be a possible research program seeking to document the functions of intentional, reflected religious communication in communities who are processing intensely these forms of social complexity. And finally, it works directly with involved civic and religious actors to bring to speech or to partner in well-judged partnerships with voices that are absent from our halls and difficult for us to perceive. To offer spaces for other communities to come in and articulate their own ideas, and for us to let our ideas be challenged, and to break down this cumbersome also their, our, us, them, and so on. But in any case, I'm very excited to learn from you, as I've now kind of summarized some of my basic ideas and why we wanted to organize this symposium. I'm very excited to learn from you. I'm very grateful you've all come, and I'm eager to observe together what theology might be doing.